Miller, and the topic that I did my paper on is the disconnect between urban heat island research and policy implementation. So a little bit about me that tells why I was interested in this. I'm a double major in environmental science and political science, so I've always kind of been interested in this relationship between science and politics. And the urban heat island, I actually did research over the summer about the urban heat island in Harrisonburg that I'll discuss a little bit later. And so it just kind of seemed right to combine the two into trying to discuss how Harrisonburg can mitigate their urban heat island implementation, or their urban heat island effect. And so you might be asking, what is the urban heat island effect? Well, it's this phenomenon where cities are typically hotter than their surrounding rural areas, right? And it can have a myriad of negative effects, such as negative effects on human health, negative effects on increased use of energy, increased carbon emissions, and even a decrease in water quality. And there's also a social justice component. So Todd Lookingbill, who's someone I worked with over the summer, he did a study in Richmond that was able to correlate the Richmond's urban heat island effect with their historical racial redlining. So there is a consensus that the urban heat island negatively affects people in lower socioeconomic brackets a lot worse than higher socioeconomic brackets. And so my research question that I kind of came into this with is, how should Harrisonburg go about mitigating their urban heat island effect? And to do that, gotta have a overview of the paper. So I'm gonna start with just kind of a discussion of the project I did over the summer, then a discussion about literature of possible remedies, basically just saying what's out there. Then what method is recommended for going about conducting scientific-based policy and implementing it. Then a brief look at some case studies that talk about this specific policy recommendation. I'll look at methodology for a proposed study that I'm trying to do next year. The results and analysis of this study, and applications and implications for of this research that I've done. So, Heat Watch Harrisonburg. So, it was a collaborative effort done between me in part with VFIC, which is the Virginia Foundation of Independent Colleges, so it was about 11 other schools. Kappa Strategies, which is the company whose logo you see there, and NOAA. And so what ended up happening is we strapped temperature loggers that logged GPS location, temperature, and humidity onto cars and had them drive these 3 separate routes 3 separate times throughout the day. And it took measurements about once every second, so we got thousands of data points. And so once we collected all this, we shipped it off to Kappa, and they used the Sentinel-2 satellite, which is owned by the European Space Agency, to essentially use land cover data in with our specific traverse point data to essentially calculate outside of the traverse point data and extrapolate it to the rest of Harrisonburg. So if we're looking at Harrisonburg, you see down here this very big blue area that's blue throughout the day. That's, I believe that's where Heritage Oaks is. It's a very big golf course and a lot more affluent, a much richer affluent area, whereas in the inner city of Harrisonburg, that is where the most dense urban heat island effect is that we see. All right, so once we've established that there is an urban heat island effect, how do you go about mitigating it? What's out there? And so there's kind of 2 camps that we talk about, abiotic factors and biotic factors. Abiotic factors are things like cool roofs and cool pavements, and they work by increasing albedo. What is albedo? Albedo is just essentially the amount of solar radiation that is reflected. So it's measured on a scale of 0 to 1. So if you're a 0, you're a black body, you absorb all radiation. If you're 1, you reflect all radiation, right? And so there are 2 ways that you can implement this. Either A, you can just replace the entire roof, or B, replace the entire pavement, or there are coatings that you can paint on, right? There are some problems with this. A, there's a problem with the specific paint that you can use, or the application that you can use, in the sense that the chemicals degrade very quickly and they can get into the environment. And so we're not necessarily sure what that effect will have if they get into the environment yet, because this is not a widely used product. There's studies being done currently that hope to mitigate that, or that attempt to explain that. And B, there is an issue of increased UV radiation exposure for humans. So think about it. Typically UV radiation will come in, and in a black body, it'll all be absorbed. But if you are reflecting it, you're kind of getting a double dose where it's hitting you from above and below, because it's reflecting back into you. So that should lead to an increase in skin cancer and other health effects. So if you're not going to do abiotic factors, you can then go to biotic factors. The most simple biotic factor is just increasing green space. So planting trees, planting grasses, that kind of stuff. You could also implement green roofs, which is similar to cool roofs, except you would put plants on roofs, essentially. It's that simple. Mosses are typically what's used, but you can use trees if you have a more sturdier kind of roof. Or you can do level living walls, which essentially has, you know how ivy likes to creep up on walls? It utilizes that and trellises to kind of use the city infrastructure to the advantage and make it a little bit cooler, right? So there is no really best technique of what we consider to do to implement this. It depends on locality. So like, for example, what we plant in Harrisonburg for our green space might be different than what Phoenix would plant, right? Based on a bunch of different local factors. So there is no really one simple answer, this is the cure-all. And part of that is because it's a wicked problem, right? So wicked problems is something that we talk about in environmental science where it's a very complicated problem and there's no one solution, and when you try to fix it, you usually create other problems. So like, for example, when you try to use cool pavements, you create all these other problems in the environment, right? And so there's scientists and policymakers have to try and fix this, and they have to try and work together. Historically, or in the past, what's been done is this thing called the loading dock theory, where scientists will produce a bunch of data, a bunch of information, and put them in these things called loading docks, which is like scholarly sources, scholarly databases, that kind of stuff. And it's up to the politicians and or policymakers to then go analyze the data themselves, come to their own conclusions, and then successfully implement it. Unfortunately, that's not always what happens, because policymakers do not have the same background knowledge typically as scientists do. So the consensus is that scientists write their papers with themselves in mind. So their audience that they're trying to write to are people like them with the same kind of background knowledge, right? Policymakers don't have that. And so there's this disconnect in the traditional loading dock theory. So there's a growing call for co-production, which that is establishing a relationship between scientists and politicians to work together to try and make policy better in terms of how you can implement it from a policy perspective versus the scientific method that's best for implementing it. And there's also a growing call for co-production to involve people like citizenry, people in NGOs, more local people that have specific local knowledge that may be beneficial in implementing policies, right? So I did a case study analysis, and I broke up my case studies in terms of government structures, so federalism, unitary governments, and fractured authoritarian governments. And so I'm going to focus on federalism, a case study in Phoenix, Arizona, done by Chow et al. And what they ended up finding is that a project called the Downtown Phoenix Urban Form Project emerged from a co-production of researchers, municipal officers, politicians, and a couple of different local NGOs that they have out there. And what they ended up doing is that they changed specific building codes. So now if you want to build a building in Phoenix, you have to meet these specific building codes to mitigate that are aimed to mitigate the urban heat island effect. So for example, one of these codes is 50% of habitable roofs, so roofs that you can like go up on, have to be shaded, right? So you would plant trees or some kind of abiotic cover, something like that, right? The other thing that they did is that they instituted encouragement, so kind of more soft policies, so things like tax breaks, preferential permits, grant opportunities, where it's like for buildings that might not be built but are already built, how we can kind of encourage that people to change those buildings, right? So then we're going to move on to, and importantly about federalism doesn't, the Phoenix, Arizona case and the Lakeway and Woodlands Township, Texas case, they never really sought out co-production. It was just something that happened. So scientists went to politicians and policymakers, not the other way around. Then we get to unitary governments with the UK and Norway, and it's kind of the opposite. The UK and Norway actually have specific institutions, so it's an institution called CFK in Norway and UKIP in the UK CIP, and they actively seek out co-production relationships. And not only that, but they establish kind of this way to protect co-production, because co-production happens, it's slower than what unitary governments are used to in terms of like implementing policy. And so, and what I mean by that is like, typically in unitary governments, if you are in control, you can do what you want, as long as you're democratically voted in. And so, the difference is that co-production involves listening to counterpoints, right? And so it takes a little bit longer than what unitary governments are used to. And so, moving on from that, we're gonna move on to fragmented authoritarianism. And so I use China for that, and China's considered a fragmented authoritarian regime because they're more susceptible to gridlock than a traditional authoritarian regime. And part of that is because they do have some semblance of a civil society that they do tend to listen to, at least a little bit. And so Wang and Xu did a study in Lide Village. It was a case study of China's urban renewal project. And this project was essentially they would go in and remove slums and try to build back better. And some of that was urban heat island mitigation tactics, right? And so what ended up happening is China tried to institute this top-down approach where they tried to use the same policy for every single city, every single municipality. That did not work in Lide Village. The case study doesn't say why. I'm not sure why. They just mentioned that it was something to do with specific environmental factors in the climate of Lide Village. And so out of that, local protesters ended up protesting this urban renewal program, and eventually China did kind of consent and start looking for co-production, but it was only after they were met with bottom-up resistance. Right? So as I was looking at all these case studies, I was interested to see that they discussed co-production as a topic rather than a process, right? So they just said, like, co-production happened and these were the outputs. They didn't really talk about all the intricacies that go in, all the human parts that must go into something like co-production happen. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in. And I'm actually in a very unique position because off of what I did over the summer, I'm actually kind of forming this coalition that will eventually result.
Trevor, go ahead. Just hit the button on the back on the wall.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I'm actually in this very unique position where I'm part of this developing co-production to mitigate Harrisonburg's urban heat island effect. And so I think it would be very interesting for me to do a participant observer's case study of Harrisonburg, so that way I can document more of the human connections and the human relationships that go into co-production and analyze how co-production can actually form and work within a smaller municipality. And so my analysis and kind of what should Harrisonburg do, there are still very large gaps in the literature, a couple that I identified. There is a very large gap in between studying larger municipalities versus smaller municipalities, right? So larger cities get all the attention in most environmental urban research, let alone urban heat island research, right? So like Shanghai, New York City, Washington, D.C., those were all the cities that I kept seeing. No cities really like Harrisonburg. Even the two cities in Texas that were kind of smaller still were double Harrisonburg's population. And so other gaps that I found, again, was co-production as a topic rather than a process, and also no real consistency around studies about co-production. So the Phoenix case study talked more about the output of it than the China case study, right? So there's no real consistency of how you cover co-production as a topic, even when they do cover it at all, right? And so what I also found is that federalism and unitary nations are a little bit more favorable to co-production than authoritarian regimes. Unitary nations even more than federalism, because unitary nations actively seek out co-production, whereas federalism kind of just expects it to happen based on their structure. There is no best approach to mitigate the urban heat island effect in terms of like specifics. There's no one cure-all. However, the recommendation is a mixture of biotic and abiotic factors. Like I said, specifics can be very different per locality, right? And what I'm really recommending Harrisonburg to do is to foster co-production, right? So, like I said, I'm kind of taking a part of starting this co-production, but it's been a little difficult. Like I've been reaching out to different officials and only have gotten a couple responses back. Not everybody is willing to take part in co-production. So my recommendation to Harrisonburg is that they should actively be seeking out these kind of relationships, right? Not just with me, but with like JMU professors, EMU professors, even their local citizenry, that kind of stuff. What I'm expecting to happen at the end of this, when it's all said and done, is a plan that looks somewhat similar to Phoenix, Arizona's plan, where they kind of mix building code changes versus building code changes with a little bit of soft incentive programs, especially considering that Harrisonburg's tax base isn't necessarily as large as some of these larger municipalities. So that's what I'm expecting to come out of it. So the implications, applications, and the future. I believe that there needs to be a complete change in how we study co-production, just completely change the methodology and use a more participant observer study. It's interesting to do it with environmental policy, because environmental policy is typically papers done on environmental policy are more empirical because they're done by environmental scientists. So they're not interested in the human relationships, they're not interested in the human connection, that kind of stuff. And Harrisonburg presents a unique opportunity not just to study co-production within a smaller locality context, but within that environmental policy context that I just talked about. And then I expect, like I said, I expect at the end, this co-production is going to merge abiotic and biotic factors and present itself as I'm hoping to present it as a model for other smaller localities on how they can implement co-production and how they can successfully mitigate their urban heat island effect. Questions?